Thank you, Member. And call the member for Chifley.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. Well, at the outset, what the Coalition should do is rename this bill, and in particular the Telecommunications Legislation Amendment Regional Broadband Scheme Charge Bill. This should be renamed the Coalition's Chickens Coming Home to Roost. That bill in particular, that bill that we're debating right now, represents all the failures of the Coalition, Deputy Speaker, accumulated, rolling into this. When you get to a point where you need to, Deputy Speaker, charge up to 500,000 Australians up to $84 a year more on their broadband, that represents the combined policy failure of the Coalition to get to that point. We get to a point where our download speeds in Australia are slower than Kazakhstan. We have Borat broadband in this country, Kazakhstan beating Australia. We fall behind the world standard. How did we get to this spot? How did we get to the spot where Borat beats us on broadband? I'll tell you how. Because you have, on this side of the chamber, early on, we don't need to legislate the importance of broadband as what's happening here, because it was in our hearts, in our heads. We realised when we looked how many times the Coalition under John Howard, 19 times they tried to get broadband plans into place, they couldn't get it done. What did we have? We had it was patchy in terms of the rollout back when John Howard was the Prime Minister and Helen Coonan was the Communications Minister. It was patchy. It was dollar-driven in terms of if you got good broadband, it was because you were in a richer area rather than the general metropolitan. In regional areas, you could forget about getting good broadband. There was no national network. It was all cobbled together based on a profit-driven approach, which even Telstra, back in the day of Sol Trujillo, a name we've forgotten right now in these days, would put up plans for broadband rollouts that were with a rate of return that were way higher than the ACCC could stomach. And it took Labor to say, no, enough's enough. We will put in a national network. We will make sure 93% of homes are fibred up. The other 7% will either get it through satellite or more mobile broadband. That's how they'll get their internet. We'll put that into place. So forget the almost 20 instances of failure from the Coalition. We said we're going to do it right the first time with fibre. And Malcolm Turnbull, now Prime Minister, then Shadow Communications Minister, knew he couldn't beat that model the way it was. Then Prime Minister Tony Abbott, or then Opposition Leader, he had one objective: destroy the national broadband network. Malcolm Turnbull, as Shadow Communications Minister, knew he couldn't do it. So all they did is they engaged in product differentiation, political product differentiation, to come up with a version of the NBN that they could try and slap the sticker on that it was the NBN, but they knew it was a dud. And they called it the multi-technology mix, which is now dubbed Malcolm Turnbull's mess, because that's exactly what's happening. They moved from fibre, they rely on HFC, on the cable broadband network that everyone was telling them was either going to cost a bundle to upgrade to even get remotely near what expectation would be. They relied on that. I mean, the Coalition always cheers mobile broadband black spot programs as if that is the substitute for having fibre to the premises in regional Australia, where they cheer on that regional Australians will have to get access to data that is more expensive and not universally as reliable as having that fibre connection. That's what they cheer on, but they don't cheer on rolling out fibre to the premises. And we've seen this embarrassed, cowardly crawling from saying they would not support fibre to the premises. It went from fibre to the node, and then it's fibre a bit further away from the node, and then it's fibre to the driveway, all inching closer to the very homes that we said, just do this right the first time, and they refused to. So they put this system in place. That is turning out to be a mess. The HFC, I remember the Prime Minister when he was Communications Minister teasing both myself and the member for Greenway, saying he'd visit Blacktown in part of the electorate I represent and the part of the electorate that the member for Greenway and the Shadow Communications Minister represents, saying, look at this, there are these HFC networks that exist, these cable broadband networks exist, and these members of parliament want to push for fibre when they could just use the cable broadband network. And as my constituents say to me, the cable broadband network works fantastically at 4 a.m. That's when it works best. You have a lot of people on, it slows down. Exactly what we had constantly told the coalition when we were in government. You rely on this network, it's affected by volume, it degrades, it costs a lot of money to actually bring it up to speed. But the coalition, because like I said earlier, they wanted product differentiation, they wanted to say they were doing anything different to Labor, put this forward. And so, when we get to this point, Deputy Speaker, when we're debating now a levy that will be placed on Australians to cover the cost, why? Well, the Shadow Minister in her contribution outlined why we had to. Because this inferior technology mix that's been foisted on us by the Prime Minister, who was then Communications Minister, championed by the Coalition, will cost $200 million more each year just to operate. And it will generate less revenue, 300 less revenue. So straight away you've got a gap of nearly $500 million. Again, reflected by deliberate decisions made by the Coalition on how they would mutate the national broadband network into this MTM, this multi-technology mix that would fail to deliver for Australian consumers. And on top of this, in August of last year, roughly 300,000 homes, of which 220 would have been revenue generating, just literally disappear off the NBN plan. The capital expenditure forecast for the rollout up nearly $1.5 billion from the year before. Another $140 million in revenue not coming back. So this levy is designed in part and is reflective of those failures that had been enacted by the Coalition. That's what happens. When you get to this point, these are the chickens coming home to roost from the Coalition. That's why this bill should be renamed in that way. A Coalition that told us they would deliver 25 megabits per second download speed for all households by December 2016. The minute they're in office, the minute they win the election, they say, oh, we couldn't make that promise, and tried to blame us for it, when everyone was telling them it wasn't achievable, and they still pressed ahead with it. Knew that they could not do that. Knew they couldn't deliver their NBN for $29 billion by the end of 2016. Knew that. So we now have nearly $50 billion as a multi-technology mix, where the questions are being raised about how much extra it's going to cost to build, how much less it's going to generate in terms of revenue, and in the meantime, Australian consumers suffer. And wonder whether or not it will be better to go on the soon-to-be rolled out 5G wireless network, where they will actively contemplate spending more on data through another system rather than use this mess of a broadband network championed by the Coalition, which then will put further questions about whether or not the actual network itself will face more of this slow drip away from it, where it loses the people that should be using the national broadband network, using a 5G network, and the revenue forecasts of Malcolm Turnbull, or the Prime Minister's network, slip even further. And so now they need to do this type of levy, put this type of levy in place, because if they don't, they're in a world of pain. And if we don't support it as well, this is the terrible position the Parliament's been put in as a result of the mess championed by the Prime Minister when he was the Communications Minister. If we don't support this, it puts NBN in a worse position. So as much as we are uptight about the fact that people will be paying nearly $100 more a year for their broadband for those areas that are not on the NBN network, as much as we're uptight about that, to not do so puts us in a worse position, and the Coalition forces the Parliament to support this on the way through, because no common sense proposition would have you put this network that's already in a bad way in a worse position. And every single person who is upset about this rollout should direct their anger to the coalition for the way they have done this. The consumers should turn the coalition into a piñata, as the member for Whitlam rightly observes, because they have been let down. The speeds aren't as fast, the network's costing more, it's not rolling out in the way that they promised, it's not delivering the speeds that they promised, and now we have to pay more for it through a consumer levy. In the architecture of what Labor put together, we had a universal pricing approach that would have seen in the areas, in the cities of the nation, cross-subsidising the rollout and the way that the service was delivered into regional Australia. And you know what? Australians wouldn't mind that whatsoever. They support the notion that if you're in the city, you can support regional areas getting this rollout. They get it. And it was ticked off, and the ACCC ticked off it. And when it was ticked off, no one ever thought in their wildest dreams we'd be coming back after having that universal mechanism in place, we'd have to come back and put a levy on top of it. No one in their mind would have thought that. But because we've got Borat's Broadband, championed by the Prime Minister, that's what we face. That's what we face. And then, on top of that, what does it do in terms of the economy? I mean, last month we had NBN release this report. They got a bunch of consultants in to bring a report together called Connecting Australia, the Impact of the NBN on Australian Lives and the Economy. Breathlessly reported. Well, guess what? Everyone in the country knew if you had a modern broadband network, what that would do for the general community and for business. But the NBN Co has to put these reports together, not to convince everyone who's already aware of that. This report seemed more likely, Deputy Speaker, to be used to convince the government of the value of the network. We all know, and you as if I might point out, Madam Deputy Speaker, who chaired the House of Reps Infrastructure and Communications Committee, and I was proud to be on the committee that you chaired at that point in time where we visited the country, and we heard directly from regional Australia in particular that said what mobile broadband networks do and the value it creates. The value it creates to the for the digital economy in this country, of which I'm a shadow minister with portfolio responsibility for. Everyone knew that. But now NBN Co has to spend good money putting these type of reports together to convince the coalition that getting this right makes a lot of sense from the economy's perspective and from community's perspective. From people in the electorate I represent, Woodcroft, who'd been stuck for ages, who we finally were able to get on the NBN rollout plan and then had that plan torn up by the Communications Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, then got put back on, but only got half the job done because the rest had cable broadband and they're now complaining about the fact that they have that. Or parts of the electorate I represent, like Glendenning, where constituents are telling me they're getting 1 megabit per second download speed. One. In some cases, half. Told that cable broadband would work and constantly frustrated by it. Rudy Hill, Mount Druitt residents telling me that they're experiencing this. And the reason why I have a problem with that is because for businesses in the CBDs of the electorate I represent in Western Sydney, they rely on a modern broadband network just as much as they'd rely on having a good connection to gas, water, electricity. Exactly right. This is fundamental for a business to run, and for those businesses to run in a way at less cost, to thrive, to put people on, to create new business opportunity that we see is occurring when you do have a modern network in place. Some of this other legislation that's before us is all straightforward. Of course, the way in which you relate or deal with developers and the infrastructure rollout and some of the stuff that's embedded in this legislation makes perfect sense. But the thing that drives us crazy is not only that there's been a distortion of what we thought could be achieved, what was possible and what should have been rolled out, but now, because of the deliberate mess by the Coalition on Broadband, we pay for it economically because the country's denied opportunity. We pay for it socially because communities are frustrated by the lack of the network. And we pay for it more as consumers through the levies that are being advocated by the coalition on this. A complete mess. As I said before, it's not the multi-technology mix, it's the Malcolm Turnbull mess. We are paying for it, and these bills represent that failure, and it's the chickens coming home to roost as a result of those bad decisions made by the coalition.
I thank the member and call the member for Melbourne.